My name's Stephenie Foster, and I'm the founder of Smash Strategies, a consulting firm that focuses on helping organizations in the public and private sector understand how gender equality and women's leadership is good for them. I'm also the author of a new book called Take Action, Fighting for Women and Girls, which outlines how you and your friends, colleagues, family members can be effective advocates in any issue area, but I especially focus on 4 topics: the importance of girls' education, the importance of women's economic empowerment, the importance of women's political participation, and the need to address gender-based violence. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the book, but also I want to acknowledge the importance of what you all do, which is play sports and athletics and work through the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics. As many of you know, Title IX really made a huge difference for women in education, most particularly women in sports, and really is a first step towards leveling the playing field for women, as opposed to the previous time when really women's athletics were not treated in the same way as men's athletics. The reason this is important is something that you all know. Not only is athletics something that you enjoy, of course, but it really builds leadership skills. And what we see from the research is that 80% of CEOs of large companies, women CEOs, played athletics, played sports. They took that opportunity to be leaders and really were able to be really the leaders that they could be. So sports obviously is something that's incredibly important. We see this throughout, all types of sports, and I know that you all are involved in all types of sports. And the good news today, I think, is that there's so much more of an emphasis on women's athletics and ensuring that women and men are treated equitably in terms of pay, in terms of training, in terms of access to opportunity. And so I know that this is important to you, but as you are playing sports and developing your leadership skills, it also builds stronger communities and in the long run, stronger countries like ours. So thank you for doing that. I want to talk a little bit about why I decided to write this book, and then again, a little bit about each of the topics. So as it says, the book is about taking action, fighting for women and girls. It's really a roadmap on advocacy, and really an advocacy obviously on issues that are important to women and girls and issues of gender equality. I wrote the book because as I've traveled around the world, both for my job, for consulting arrangements, and just in general, I talk to a lot of people who are really focused on equality, gender equality, racial equality, ensuring that everybody has equal access to opportunity. And at the same time, there's a sense of, the problem is so big, what can I do about it? And I realized that I have done a lot of work in advocacy over the years, and so I could take what I knew and really outline for people a way to do advocacy in kind of simple steps, and then give people resources, whether those are facts and figures about each issue, TV shows, social media, podcasts, books that people could use to, again, learn more about each issue or suggest to other people, role models, women who've come before, so that we think about how the work builds on the work that's been done by other people, and also a list of organizations that you can think about joining up with, or at least using as a resource for the work you do in each of these issue areas. So I would say, really importantly on advocacy, one of the most important things is to really be as strategic as you can be in terms of what you're asking for. We all know that there are a tremendous number of issues in the world, but really thinking about, is it about equal pay for athletes? Is it about equal access to training facilities? Is it about security on campus? Is it about trying to figure out how women have equal access to health, every kind of healthcare service needed? I think it's important to really obviously take your passion, but do it in a way that gives the people you're lobbying, the decision makers, the policy makers, whether they're elected officials or at your university or in your community, an idea of what you specifically are asking them to do. And so as you think about your role as advocates, being as clear as possible about what you're asking for is incredibly important. It's also important to ask questions all the time so that you can understand what are the differences, for example, in security situations at a campus. What about lighting? Have there been arrests of people who are alleged perpetrators? How are women who are making claims of sexual assault and sexual harassment treated? How many people have been convicted? All those kinds of issues really help you understand the problem better. And so as you're thinking about advocacy, think about those questions as well. The last point I want to mention when we talk about advocacy is the importance of understanding who the decision makers are. In some cases, it is an elected official. It could be a city council member, a member of Congress, a member of the state legislature, but it could also be somebody at your university. It could be the student body president. It could be the president of the university. It could be a campus organization that has sort of jurisdiction over the issue. So really understanding who can help you reach your goal. It's often more than one person or more than one entity, but you want to make sure that as you're being strategic, knowing what you're asking for, that you're also asking the right people. You can ask people who aren't decision makers, and that's fine too, but really it's not the most effective use of your time as an advocate. And as we all know, we have a limited amount of time to really take actions that make a difference. So in the book, I focus on 4 issues. As I mentioned, I'll go through them in a minute. One of the most important things, though, to note is that this framework of advocacy can work for any issue, not just the ones I outline. I chose these 4 because I do think they are important both here in the United States and around the world. Based on the work I've done, I've seen that these issues are issues that really can make a difference if we address them in a strategic way and make change. But don't be limited by them. If there are issues that you care about that aren't covered here, then that's great too. But it gives people a framework, I think, again, of how to look at an issue strategically and move forward. So the first issue I talk about is one that is extremely relevant here, of course, which is the importance of equal access to education for girls and boys, young men and young women. We know around the world that for every extra year of school that a girl has, she makes very different life choices. She marries later, has fewer children, spaces them out as she wants her family to be spaced. She tends to obviously get a higher paying job and be more active in her community. So we really can see that education is almost the most important thing that we can ensure that girls and young women have access to. Around the world, we do know now that in terms of primary education, so obviously up to about 5th or 6th grade, there's actually a fairly equal number of girls and boys enrolled now. That wasn't true 20 years ago, but it's certainly true today, due to a lot of efforts by governments and big donors, the UN, and all sorts of organizations that have really focused on education. Where there's a gap now around the world is really in secondary education, the place where we all get our skills for analytics and critical thinking. We see that there aren't as many young women as young men in those classes, and that parents tend to, if forced to, choose to send their sons to school, not their daughters. Now, interestingly, this isn't true in the United States. Actually, young women in the United States have higher levels of higher education than men. But it does go to the issue of really ensuring that we think about making sure that not only do young women and young men have equal access to education broadly, but equal access to study the topics and subjects that they're interested in. While there certainly are more young women in colleges in the US, in general, there are not that same number of young women in, say, science, technology, education, engineering, and math subjects, the STEM fields. Actually, there's quite a disparate number of young women and young men there. So we need to ensure that we aren't pushing girls to one kind of subject and boys to another and making those kind of assumptions about what people should study and what they should be. Those kind of gender norms obviously start early, as you know they do in athletics. And so one of the things, though, that athletics gives people is a way to really break out of some of the more traditional gender norms and think about their own careers and their own futures in the most broad way. The second topic that I talk a lot about in the book is economic empowerment. Really the need to ensure that women and men have equal access to economic opportunity. We know that if that were the case globally, that if men and women participated in the labor force in equal numbers in their countries everywhere, that there would be an increase of global GDP of about at least $12 trillion, probably more. And to put that number in perspective, that's the GDP of the US and China combined, so the world's two largest economies. So though this is incredibly important, and when we think about economic empowerment, it's really the gamut of issues, from ensuring that women have equal access to education and skill development, that women have equal access to the corporate boardroom, equal access to high-level jobs in corporations, but also that women have the ability to borrow money and start their own businesses. As we've seen during COVID, there's been an incredible increase in entrepreneurship. And in part, I think, because it gives people a sense of control, and also because a lot of the jobs that people had have either gone away for a while, or people have decided they don't want to continue on the path they had before. But we need to make sure that as that's happening, that women entrepreneurs have equal access to loans and funding from banks and other financial institutions. Economic empowerment is obviously critically important. It not only has an impact on an individual, but on their family and on their community. One other thing I always like to mention when I talk about economic empowerment is that there are laws on the books around the world that can actually make it harder for women to have equal access to economic opportunity. The World Bank does a study that comes out every couple years called Women, Business, and the Law. And in that account, it's a kind of a ranking. It looks at laws across the board, everything from are there any constraints on the types of jobs women can hold, when women have to retire, are there laws about whether husbands can have to consent to their wives' workplace. So, are there sexual harassment laws in place? So as we see around the world, there are vast issues in the legal system. Countries are getting better. More and more changes are being made in the law to ensure that women have equal access, but there are still issues. There are about 190 countries that are surveyed in the Women, Business, and Law report, and we still see a substantial number of countries where women can't do certain jobs. Certain job classifications are closed to them, and some countries where women have to retire at an earlier age than men. And obviously the issue there is if women retire at an earlier age than men, they have less funding to put into any kind of retirement or pension, and women do tend to live longer. So that can have an impact on women's, relative poverty or lack of poverty as she ages. So economic empowerment isn't just about what's going on today, but how it has an impact going forward. The third issue I talk about is women's political participation. As I said, many women who have been active in athletics are now in high-level jobs in companies. The same is true in terms of public life. And so we see that the U.S. still is not really doing the best relative to other countries in terms of the number of women in Congress, although it's increased in the last couple of years, 5 years. We're about 75th around the world in terms of where we stand. So we have a long way to go. But we do know from the research that when women are participating in Congress or parliaments at higher levels, there tend to be different perspectives brought to public policy. And that can be everything from a different perspective on how funds should be spent. There's one study that shows that as more women are in parliament in particular countries, more funding is spent on education. Another that talks about more funding spent on access to clean water, which was important in that particular country, which has had a lot of sanitation issues. We also know that when women are, have higher number of women in parliaments, that countries tend to sign environmental treaties at higher numbers. Women are obviously looking at issues from their life experience, as is everyone. And of course, not to say that all women think alike, because of course, not all women do. But the statistics do show that as more women get engaged, these different perspectives are brought to public policy and public life. And so I really hope that you all think about doing that as well, because you have specific life experiences and perspectives that I think are critical to the way that decisions get made. And again, that's everything from what you're seeing on your day-to-day life now and looking forward. How do you want the world to look as you see out over the next 20, 30, or 40 years? What priorities do you think your community policymakers should have? How do you want to make sure that funds are spent? So I think the public policy issues are important, and thinking about how to be engaged makes a huge difference. The last issue I talk about in the book is obviously addressing gender-based violence and sexual harassment. These are issues that are, unfortunately everywhere. They're in athletics, they're in businesses, they're in organizations, they're on college campuses, and they're everywhere around the world. So we know that obviously these are issues that have an adverse impact on an individual, but they also really affect a community, and they affect a person's family. If these incidents occur at the workplace, they have a huge drain on productivity at a workplace for obvious reasons. People either don't come to work, or they come to work and they're less focused because of what's going on in the rest of their lives. So these are issues we need to think about and pay attention to. We saw during COVID there was an increase in reporting of domestic violence. And not surprising, people were in their homes with people who are abusers in COVID, and that didn't, before COVID and after COVID, people will leave their homes or leave the classrooms or leave a place where they are sort of stuck with somebody who's an abuser. So these are issues to pay a lot of attention to. There are obviously legal changes that need to be made around issues of gender-based violence. But I think this is an issue area where we all can take action. If you hear somebody talking about women in a derogatory way, it's important to stop that conversation, to ask your male friends to stop that conversation, to really weigh in and say that's not how they think about women. Because I think a lot of this is ensuring that there's not a normalization of gender-based violence, or of sort of, over that sexual harassment isn't that big a deal. So we need to really ask our friends to take action on an individual basis to stop gender-based violence and to stop the things that lead up to it, so that we don't have to worry about safety and security. Again, this can be an issue that's taken up at every level and in every kind of environment. So with that, I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. I think obviously you are people who are very engaged in your universities and your colleges and your leaders yourselves. So not only do I hope that you take something from this book and this idea of advocacy, but that you help others as well be part of a movement to really ensure that we are building a more equitable world, not just for men and women, but for everybody. I know that today there's so much talk and interest in inequality, and I think we need to move from talking about it to doing something. I think the book really does that, lays out some very specific things that you can do, again, about those issues. or about, increasing people's interest in athletics, women's athletics, whether it's encouraging people to go to games, to really ensuring that media reports on women's athletics the same as they report on men's athletics, to ensure that there's a focus on, again, equity in pay and training as people are moving into a more professional, into professional athletics. So I really hope that this book is helpful to you. I know that you are not only leaders today, but you will take the skills you develop in athletics into your leadership in whatever you choose to do next, whether you decide to continue in athletics and sports or become a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, or anything else, really taking these leadership skills with you and building for a stronger and more equitable future. Thanks so much for listening. And again, I hope you take action and fight for women and girls.